Hello and welcome to your full moon video for the full moon in Scorpio on the 4th of May 2015. The full moon will be in Scorpio and the lunar mansion of Vishakha. This is also going to serve as your week ahead forecast for the 1st of May to the 8th of May. Well, the seeds of revolution are most definitely germinating. I don't really need to go into detail. I think you probably have an idea on the personal scale in terms of that, and also on the global scale in terms of the upheaval that seems to be going on in the world. It's just really massive right now. And unless you follow things like sesquiquadrates, which is considered a minor aspect in astrology, you might not necessarily pick up on the full astrological implications of what's going on. So we're going to talk about a sesquiquadrate aspect, which is going to happen later on in the week between Saturn and Uranus. But one thing that I wanted to really kind of go into depth with is when the realization of the truth of how things are, how people have been disenfranchised, how people have been repressed for so long, when it finally begins to surface and dawn to those people. Some people are still asleep. You know, it should be obvious to most people, right? But some people are still asleep and not picking up on it. But growing numbers are beginning to pick up on the concept that they've been disenfranchised and they don't like it. And no matter how much somebody might want to repress something like that or keep it beneath the surface, well, it's something that ultimately is going to rise up above the surface. I'm not, saying or being political here on any level. I'm just speaking the truth of the astrological alignments that are really there beneath the surface, and it's all about the truth and the truth beginning to surface, and a decision between where to go next. And this is both on the personal level and the global level. I think that humanity, especially this week, is being forced to take a look at what's going on the planet, with changes on the planet. I discovered, through doing some research, that there are 7 concurrent volcano eruptions that were going on this week. One of them was in Italy. I don't remember where the rest of them were. I know there was one in Chile. But there's so much going on globally. And then, obviously, of course, we had the earthquake. And then we look at what else is going on the socio-political level, and you see a lot germinating in Baltimore. Something which has been brewing for a long time and really kind of goes back even further, into the 50s and the 60s and the civil rights movement, but not really getting too deeply into that. But the thing that I want to touch on is we can't repress our feelings about the truth. On the individual level, when something surfaces to you, something that you don't like or something that's unacceptable in your life, it's a natural impulse to want to take steps to change it. And the transformation has to happen. The old status quo can't stay in place. And again, that's on the individual level too. Something new has to happen. New growth has to occur in order for things to transform. And if the level of repression or keeping things beneath the surface is so great, or the covering up of truth is so great, well, then the stronger the rising up against the repression. We're going to talk a little bit about these particular aspects, what they are relating to, mainly on the personal level. But I think you'll begin to get an idea of what's going on the global level too in relation to this. And we're going to do that now once I shift over into the astrology software. We start off the week on the 1st of May. One of the things I want to point out to you, let's kind of shift, I know that's not a very good intro there, but let's kind of shift back to what's happened recently over the course of the last several years. We had a very tense aspect going on between Pluto and Uranus. Those two planets are now separating from their tense aspect known as a square, but that square is still very much in place and should not be ignored. Well, on the 1st of May, what we have happening is the moon crossing the plane of that square. So what's going to happen is over the course of the day on the 1st, you're going to have the moon squaring Pluto and the moon opposing Uranus. That creates something that's known as a T-square and can create some very tense energy. The moon will be in Chitra when this is happening. And Chitra relates to that which we know to be right and true in our heart, that which we know to be our destiny, and really understanding and being with the truth of our heart. And there's an awareness, there's an awakening as to what that is. If there's been any lack of clarity in your life in relation to this, well, the 1st of May could be a day when you begin to gain some added clarity on it. And what's going to happen? Well, the truth in very Plutonian fashion is going to dawn on you, right? And it's going to make you determined to create some changes in relation to whatever might be surfacing in your life. Obviously, I can't know that without looking at your chart, but we'll talk more about that later. And it's going to force you into beginning to, and I imagine you have been already, but beginning to look more deeply into what the next steps need to be. Pluto's in Purva Ashadha, and Purva Ashadha always relates to, on one level, getting down to the authenticity and the reality of a situation. It's associated with the causal nature of the soul. And in this material world, we tend to pile layer upon layer upon layer onto the soul of superficiality. We put layer upon layer of superficiality on the soul and wear a mask in order to get by in our day-to-day existence. Well, there's a realization and a recognition that that's something that can no longer continue on the level that it has been, and that a change is ultimately very necessary. So you may find yourself confronting that and looking at what might happen next, because we've got our good friend Uranus wanting to create the seeds of change over in Revati. One good way to look at Revati Nakshatra is as the great womb of time. It's where things germinate. And as you may know, Uranus is a very revolutionary energy. It always wants to create new things in new forms, right? So it's the idea of where are things going to go next now that you're realizing and recognizing this truth within your heart. What do you do with this information? What steps do you take? These are likely going to be the questions that you're asking yourself over the course of the day. And shifting forward another day to the 2nd of May. And if you bear with me, I'm just going to change my astrological software. We have a harmonious alignment that's going to be going on between Mercury and Jupiter. Now, this is known as a quintile. It's an aspect of 72 degrees, right? And what makes this particular aspect very powerful and very strong is the fact that Jupiter is in a section of Leo that is governed over by Mercury. So that's going to trigger that energy on a grander scale. Let's start with Jupiter in Ashadha and Leo. And what that's about is a recognition of strength through going into a deep process, going deeply into something, going deeply into your feelings about a particular situation, really going over the information almost to the level that you become entranced and hypnotized by the situation that you're dealing with. It can represent those thoughts and feelings which we just can't tend to put out of our mind, and in many cases really shouldn't, because there's a very deep revelation within this energy, especially in association with the energy of the previous day. Now, Mercury will be in Gemini, and Mercury rules Gemini, so Mercury's right at home there, so it's going to be a very powerful energy for Mercury on that day, and Mercury is in the nakshatra of Kritika. Kritika is purifying. It gets rid of those things which are no longer working, which are keeping an individual from being the person that they're meant to be that keeps them from doing the things that they're meant to do. All of that is achieved through Kritika. I often like to describe Kritika as the etheric tube. And that's going to sound a little bit foo-free, but I'm going to explain what I mean in relation to that. The connection between the individual and the super consciousness, so to speak. And that tube kind of gets all clogged up with our rubbish, our superficial layers that we pile on, as I was saying before. Well, Kritika is about clearing all of that stuff out so that you can function as a clear channel for the truth. How that relates on the personal level, well, going deeply into this information, even though it may be something ultimately that is difficult to face, well, it's something that is going to be helpful to go into, because through that truth comes empowerment. And that is something which is definitely going to help you to get through whatever this trial may represent for you on the grand scale. On the global scale, if we want to kind of toss that thought over a little bit, well, I think that, let's talk about the situation in Baltimore just briefly. I think you're going to find that over the course of the next several days, some sort of report comes out about what actually happened. I know the police have decided to not make that publicly apparent, but I think that information is going to surface over the course of the next several days, and I think you're going to see some very hard and painful truths coming to the surface in relation to that. But that's just my opinion, and who knows, I could be wrong, but that's what the energy seems to suggest, and energy very seldom lies. So we'll see. And that's the energy of Mercury quintiling Jupiter on the 2nd. Let's shift on to the 3rd. And what do we have going on the 3rd? We've got an opposition between Mercury, again, Mercury's very active this week, and Saturn. Saturn's in Anuradha, and I want to talk about Anuradha for a moment or two. Anuradha, there's a lot of friction within this particular lunar mansion or within this nakshatra. There's the desire to blossom, but there's also the restraint. There's restraint because of devotion to a particular concept, a particular philosophy, perhaps even a particular person. But getting so wrapped up in that sense of devotion and restraining oneself in relation to that is keeping forward motion from happening. Mercury is going to shift into the nakshatra of Rohini as we shift onto the 3rd. And Rohini can be looked at as being connected with the process of evolution, allowing one to grow, allowing one to move on with the information that has ultimately surfaced, whether that be on the personal level or on the mass level. There's the information there that's possible to help things to head in the direction that they need to head in, but there's a sense of restraint. I like to look at this particular connection in terms of the global scale. I'm not even touching on one particular situation, but it's the recognition of people being held down by circumstances for far too long, being held down by economy, being held down by oppression, whatever that oppression might be. And it's a recognition of the growth that needs to happen, but there's still the feelings of the restraint. The restraints are still very much in place. And, sure, on the mass level, who knows, they may be very much in place for quite a long time. But there's a growth that's happening, and there is a shift that's beginning to occur, albeit very slowly. Now, shifting on to the 4th, now you're going to begin to, I think, see why I am going into this whole concept of revolution on such a very deep scale. What do we have going on the 4th? Early in the morning hours of the 4th, we're going to have a full moon in Scorpio. And that full moon in Scorpio is going to take place in the nakshatra of Vishakha. Vishakha, again, there's a turbulence related to this particular nakshatra as well, because there are oppositional forces which are playing on the consciousness of the individual through this. There's restraint, but there's also a lot of tension in terms of feeling a need to make some sort of movement, but that movement is not wanting to be made until there's a realization or coming to a space of balance. There's a complete blend of, and I'll explain these as I go along, Rajasic, Tamasic, and Sattvic energy. Now, Rajasic energy is very racy, okay? Tamasic energy is very dense and also somewhat resistance. Sattvic energy is balance. These are known as the three gunas, and they compose all of creation. Well, all of these forces condense and take place within Vishakha. So we've got a full moon that's taking place in Vishakha, and there's a very deep restlessness and also a very profound sense of realization and recognition. And what makes this particular full moon even more powerful is that you've got a tense aspect between Saturn and Uranus that becomes exact on that day. The numbers are off here, but over the course of that day, that aspect does become exact. And it's an aspect of 135 degrees. This is called a sesquiquadrate. It's considered a minor aspect, but you can't let that concept deceive you, because it's considered a minor aspect because it only is really applicable when it's within a degree. But Saturn and Uranus are both very slow-moving planets. So a degree can be a very long time. In the case of Saturn, that can be, a few weeks. So in case of Uranus, it can be even longer. So it's energy that brews for quite a long time when it's dealing with outer planets. And again, if we go back to what's happening with Saturn, there's that sense of restraint, that sense of being held back, that sense of repression, which ultimately, because with Anuradha is symbolized by a lotus. So it's related to the flowering of potential. The flowering of potential, allowing something to grow. And the whole symbolism of the lotus flower is very important. And I recognize you're probably experiencing a very profound process associated with all of these, because we're also going through, each of us, quite a very unique personal revolution, right? And the lotus flower, its roots are very deep in the mud of the pond that it sits on top of. And it flowers and grows up to reach the sky. There's very, 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 very powerful energy. I should say, if it doesn't grow up to reach the sky, it opens up to the sun, opens up to the heavens, right? So there's a very deep recognition and realization of potential, but there's still that energy of feeling held back. And we've got Uranus again over in Revati. And Revati is saying that something is germinating, but we need to analyze the situation. We need to look at the facts. We need to understand very deeply what's going on before we let whatever is germinating come into full creation. But the thing to understand with this is a sesquiquadrate, as it's 135 degrees, equals a square, which is a tense angle, and a semi-square, which is another tense angle put together. So it's a very explosive aspect, right? So there's going to be some tension simmering beneath the surface, and likely little explosions here and there. You'll probably notice that over the media, just as a heads up. Obviously we want things in the world to stay calm, but it's part of the natural process of creation. Change doesn't happen simply, right? And on the individual level, change doesn't always happen on the individual level very simply. So sometimes we have to overturn the old status quo in order to create something new in our lives, right? So this very deeply ties into the process of Saturn and Uranus. And this coincides with the full moon in Scorpio. And as if that wasn't enough, we've also got a tense angle between the Sun and Jupiter. We spoke of Jupiter being in Ashadha, going very deeply into that recognition of the potential of the I should say the potential for change. That's what I was reaching for in my brain there for a moment. Going very deeply into that potential for change, tossing it over, understanding it. But also the sun, it should be understood, is in Bharani. And Bharani has a several stage process, right? And one of the stages, basically I should state that Bharani is about moving on to a different phase of life. But what tends to happen is a several stage process of recognition of something and then reflecting back on a situation that once was before one is able to shift forward. And that growth that comes through Bharani, because Bharani is symbolized by the birth canal, so it always gives birth to something, okay? That growth that comes through Bharani always has certain labor pains that are attached to it. So each of us individually has to look at our own personal revolution and look at the growing pains that might be involved, the labor pains that it might take in order to bring a new cycle of our lives into creation, and assess what will be worth it and what would not be worth it. And that's something that this process of the full moon is really very deeply suggesting. It's a several layered process. Then we move ahead on to the 6th. And on the 6th, well, the process deepens on an even grander scale, because what we've got going on is the sun and Pluto become exact in a harmonious trine with each other. This represents coming to a realization of how to be truest to ourselves. How can we be true to ourselves? How can we be authentic and live our life in alignment with our destiny? Even though living our life in alignment with our destiny may represent friction with other individuals, and it may also represent friction with our own ego, and we have to look at the particular sacrifice that we need to make. But you can either live your life in alignment with your soul, or you can try to live your life in alignment with the ego. On the grander scale, hey, it's all within the universe's will. But, you know, we do have the whole concept of making decisions, albeit an illusionary concept dependent upon your belief system. We do have free will, and we can choose to exercise that free will. Best way to exercise that free will is aligning our mind and heart, as I've been talking in the previous days, with the soul. And this happens through a process that's related to Purva, Ashadha, and Bharani. This represents a moving on, a shift, a growth, but a decision to be true to one's beliefs, true to one's ideals. On the world scale, you're likely going to find that sometime around the 6th, some sort of information surfaces that's been hidden beneath the surface, because that always happens with these Sun-Pluto trines. Something surfaces, a revelation surfaces. And with all the deep energy that's beneath the surface, the revolutionary energy in connection with the Saturn-Uranus sesquiquadrate, well, there's going to be some movement, there's going to be some transformation. It's only natural, and really, on a certain level, it's only necessary. What happens on the tail end of that? Well, there is a potential for nurturing positive growth on the individual level and healing of a deep wound, because our good friend Venus is going to shift into security-loving Cancer. But Venus will be in Ardra as that is going on. So the thing to watch out for is to become so thickly and deeply involved in our feelings that we lose our sense of awareness and our ability to grow. Venus is, on one level, Venus does not like being in Cancer. On another level, it can create some very interesting and nurturing feelings as that Venus-Moon energy blends. But basically, Venus considers the Moon an enemy, because Venus is a very, well, it's a planet that likes to compete with the sun and the moon. In Vedic astrology, we have planetary friendships and enmities. And the sun and the moon are considered the luminaries. And Venus wants to shine as well, too. Venus represents things associated with beauty, things associated with creative expression. So Venus wants the limelight, too. So it has a little bit of enmity towards the sun and the moon. So the process here is not getting so caught up in a dull sense of feelings or a dull sense of beliefs that a person misses the bigger picture. Venus, through its transit of Cancer, is going to bring some things to the surface in relation to that. It's a very profound week. Seems like there's not many aspects going on. I know I've spoken a lot, but that's just because the very few aspects that are going on are exceptionally powerful and need to be understood, because it's a week where there's the ability for profound change, but you may have to face some difficult circumstances in your own personal life. On the global scale, there's also a potential for shift. There's also a potential for positive motion, but that positive motion may end up coming at a cost. And that's, on a certain level, sadly enough, that's just how the grand play of consciousness plays out. If you'd like to know a little bit more about how all of these aspects will impact you personally, I do offer a vast range of astrological services that are available through my website. There is a link down in this YouTube video, unless you've closed that link already. If you have, there's one further down in the description area. Available are person-to-person consultations, which are interactive consultations using this very tool that I'm talking to you through at the moment. Taking you on a tour of your chart. There are also in-depth personalized video reports, which are recorded as a monologue using this same tool. And of course, the written reports, for those of you who like the written word, all available through the Astrological Services page of my website. And hey, if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube page yet, please consider doing so that you can get regular updates every time a new video is released. That's going to do it for this full moon video forecast and week ahead forecast. Until next time, please do take the very, very best care of yourself. Bye now.